Good evening, this is Brown at Brown. Hope everyone's doing okay, especially with the heat we've had as of late. Welcome to summer in Texas. So tonight we're going to be talking about Brunner, the Bounty Hunter by C.L. Warner. So this was a collection that focuses on, as you can see, the character of Brunner, who is a bounty hunter in the world of Warhammer Fantasy. And so Warhammer Fantasy, it's a gaming franchise that's been around for, quite some time. We're talking a couple of decades at least. And, it's basically, I guess you could say, try and imagine, the fantasy, of Lord of the Rings mixed with, I guess the, morally gray complexity of Game of Thrones. And so, you could combine the two together, and that's kind of the setting of Warhammer Fantasy in a nutshell. But anyway, though, the character of Brunner, as written by C.L. Warner, is a character who, was basically a very popular addition to the lore of Warhammer Fantasy. And I don't know if he's ever been, cast as a playable character. I've never actually played any of the games, but as far as the lore goes, the short stories and novels in which he appeared in were very popular. And so this book, this Omnibus, it was put out under the heading of Warhammer Chronicles, which those are a series of omnibuses that collect classic stories from the Warhammer Fantasy setting, and so in this case we have 3 whole novels plus one short story in this huge book right here. And so we have the novels Blood Money, Blood and Steel, and Blood of the Dragon, as well as the short story What Price Vengeance. And that particular short story was my introduction to the character of Brunner, and I actually read that short story in a collection of Warhammer Fantasy short stories, and that was the first time I'd ever come across the character of Brunner. But when I found out that there was a whole, omnibus with his adventures, I was like, hey, I'm in. So anyway, though, this was I would say that if you're interested in the setting of Warhammer Fantasy, like if you've never played any of the games, or you've never actually read any of the books, but maybe you've looked up some of the lore, but you want to see what it's like to, I guess, read a consistent series of stories, placed in that setting with a central character. I would actually say that from what I've read so far, this is actually an ideal introduction to the world of Warhammer Fantasy, because you see it from the perspective of a human being, and so therefore when it comes to the morally gray nature of that setting, as seen through the eyes of a human, then events that take place become that much more urgent, and the characters that much more relatable. And C.L. Warner actually does a very good job of giving us characters who are very much fleshed out, whether they be minor or major characters. And one of the neat things about the short story and the first 2 novels collected in here, Blood Money and Blood and Steel, is that they're told, the way they're formatted is that there's a writer who is basically on the run due to a story of his that basically turned out to be too true, and certain parties didn't like the information it gave to the public, and so he's had to go on the run, go into hiding, hiding out in taverns, trying to eke out a living by recording stories from people who come in, and even though they're sloshed, they say they're the greatest heroes of the Empire or Britonia, and so but he's like, okay, this is BS, but I gotta make a living. So he starts trying to craft stories from drivel, and hopefully turn out a few nuggets worth of tales that'll pay for a roof and lodging for him. But it's in one of these settings in which he meets the man that is known as Brunner, the bounty hunter. And this guy would honestly give Boba Fett a run for his money, I believe, if the two were ever paired up, because this guy is basically a mythic figure. I mean, he's just a man, but he's someone who has a reputation that he will pursue you to the chaos wastes if he's been paid to either take you in or kill you. And he often prefers to take his targets dead as opposed to alive, much less resistance. And he has a series of intimidating weapons, some of which are visible, and others which are rather craftily hidden on his person. But he's a guy who's been in the line of bounty hunting for a long time, and he's acquired years of experience, and he's basically someone who is very little is beneath him, but he does have some code of honor, if you will, a very loose code of honor. Basically, if you give him money to capture or kill someone, or just to do something, he will see that contract out to the end. And very rarely does he ever fail to complete a contract. And basically he cannot be bought. And those who try to bribe him, for their lives, often find that they should have kept their mouths shut and hope for the best. But anyway, though, basically you give him money for a job, you get your money's worth. But anyway, though, this particular writer, the one who's on the run, happens to meet him one night, and the two end up striking up a very odd friendship. And the guy, just on the spur of the moment, introduces himself, and and who tells Brunner what he does, and asks if he'd be willing to share some of his adventures, because he knows that while most of the guys that he's been talking to in the bars are predominantly drunkards or sailors who have maybe have some brush with something the supernatural or something dangerous, but they exaggerate it up to 11. Basically they're talking out of their keisters. Well, Brunner is someone who has seen some stuff and done some stuff, and so anything he relays to this guy, instead of there being just a grain of truth in a mountain of lies, this writer is going to get the truth. And so Brunner, the way the two books and the short story are relayed, it's like the two first novels that are collected in here are almost like anthologies, in the sense that they consist of multiple short stories that Brunner tells to the writer whenever they happen to meet up, because oftentimes they just by coincidence happen to be in the same pub or maybe in the same town, and and they'll start talking, and Brunner will, whether asked or not, start to talk to the writer and basically give him more information, to this one writer than anyone, else that we come across in this collection. And and it's only in Blood of the Dragon that we have a story in which we're not seeing things that are being told to the writer. It's treated as a story in which Brunner is the central character, and most of the events are seen through his eyes. Although other characters come into play, and we see from their perspectives as well. It's the one story in this collection that's not treated as if it's a story being relayed to the writer who went on to become one of the few friends that Brunner has. And so anyway, though, so it makes for a fascinating sense of perspective, because you're trying to figure out, okay, how much of this is embellishment on the writer's part, and how much of this is what actually happened, as per Brunner's tellings of the events. And regardless, though, I mean, you get some really good stories, and oftentimes a lot of this is fantasy mixed with horror. And the thing is, even though there are monsters and demons that show up in these tales, a lot of the times the most horrific of evils comes from Brunner's fellow man, and unfortunately that's something that's all too relatable. And I thought, as far as horror goes, that was a pretty good point in its favor. But also, I really liked how, like I said, you're seeing things from the perspectives of, a human protagonist in this, grimdark setting. And, so whenever, either Brunner or one of the other characters interacts with something dangerous, whether it be, a human evil or a supernatural evil, it feels that much more potent, because, when it comes to, say, like the character of Brunner, we know that he's a dangerous, individual, and, he's more than capable of defending himself, because he's someone who, scouts out, all the, terrain, he does, whatever research he needs to do to, I guess, counter, any dangers that he's going to come up against. There's still the fact that he's an ordinary human, albeit one who is very much skilled in the art of bounty hunting. And so, because he's a just flesh and blood human, there's always the chance that he could very well die on one of his adventures. And in fact, he comes very close to dying in more than one of the stories collected in here. And that's another thing, the danger always feels real. Whenever, there's a battle, or an ambush, I mean, it's, white knuckle, edge of your seat thrills. And so, the other thing that I liked about it was that, you know that there's a backstory to Brunner. You know that there's a past, a series of traumas that has shaped and defined this man. And, both in the stories that are being relayed to the writer who's writing down Brunner's tales, as well as in this one novel in here where you see primarily from his perspective, or that of other characters around him, you gradually start to get pieces of a puzzle that form a picture that by the end of this collection you put two and two together, and you realize who Brunner really is, and what happened to him that basically changed him from one very different individual into the cold, echo of humanity that, he is now as a bounty hunter. And, when you find out as you put the story together, it's told in snippets, whether it be flashbacks or, someone who, maybe recognizes, a weapon that Brunner has, like the sword, Drake's Malice. That comes into play on more than one occasion, as in, the one, piece from his, past life that, he's willing to, fight and kill for, in a sense of, no one's taking that away from him. And other people that he comes across occasionally recognize it as well. But anyway, though, you just get snippets of the backstory. But, by the time you put enough of it together, you have an idea of who he used to be and why he is the way he is now. And he's a very cold individual. And at some points, when he's going after someone, I mean, you see just how ruthless he is in the ways in which he hunts his targets down, as well as how he keeps them confined. And mercy is something that very rarely comes from him. Or if there is a shred of mercy, it's in the fact that he's letting his target live, as opposed to, say, outright killing them and taking their head or their corpse to, or whatever body part that his clients requesting is from. So anyway, though, yeah, but the thing is, like I said earlier, when it comes to, say, payment, if he takes a job, if he's paid for a job and he takes a job, he will see it through to the end, and he's not the kind of guy who's going to take the money and run. He's going to do his job. And that actually comes to, I'm not going to say bite him, in the keister, but it does make for some interesting situations, because there's one occasion at least wherein he's given he takes a contract to kill someone, but in the process, though, he has occasion to fight alongside his target's family, and naturally, they don't know that he's there to kill this individual until, say, it's too late. And so Brunner does kill the guy, but the guy, the target, before he dies, or before Brunner kills him, he actually contracts him to kill the guy who ordered his death. And he does it in a way in which he asks Brunner, what's the price of a pig in such and such town? And Brunner tells him something to the effect of like 3 copper coins, or a certain amount of copper coins, basically a very low monetary amount. But the guy, he takes out that exact amount and puts it on the table, and at that point, he's like, okay, do what you have to do. And so Brunner kills the guy, but he makes a point, for the last thing the guy sees, is that Brunner is, instead of just taking, the whole money sack that the guy had, he just takes the copper coins that, were, being paid to him to kill the guy who ordered the other guy's death. And so, and another thing that happens in the same story is that one of the family members stumbles upon Brunner in the act of doing something very gruesome to the guy's body, well, because it's part of the contract. And so the family member is rightfully outraged and tries to kill Brunner, and Brunner is able to easily fight the guy off, and it's very much within his power to kill this outraged family member, but instead he knocks the guy out when he very clearly could have killed him. And that's one of the few times that he actually goes out of his way to, not murder, someone. And you get the idea that the reason he did that is, one, his contract was strictly for, the guy he killed, and not the family members that he was with. And two, because he had occasion to fight alongside this family against a threat of monsters. There was a sort of camaraderie that was developed, and so there's just enough of a shred of honor left within Brunner that seems to be left over from his life from before he was a bounty hunter. And so basically you find that it happens in multiple stories. So even though Brunner, for the most part, it can't be bothered with, things like compassion, there are occasions in which, he either, shows mercy when it's counterproductive, or maybe not counterproductive, but it's something that wouldn't necessarily make sense to someone who was absolutely without a conscience. But I mean, there are other occasions though where, for instance, he's assigned to track an orc leader, an orc warlord, and the person that he's riding with, along with the guy's retinue, is a person of royalty. And he's never fought an orc in his life, but he believes in the old legends that all orcs are lazy. They run in terror at the sight of armed men, things like that, which Brunner knows is absolutely not the case. And Brunner tries to give some advice, because he's being paid to lead this guy to the orc warlord. But he gives the this person of royalty some advice on we should ride such and such distance in time in order to catch up with the orcs. And so the guy blows Brunner's advice off. And so at first you're thinking that this is just going to be your stereotypical aristocrat who is full of himself and is going to refuse to do anything that Brunner says, and basically either Brunner's going to kill him or the guy's going to get killed by his own stupidity or something like that. And you're thinking it's going to be something that's been done before, but what ends up happening is this whole village gets massacred because they refused to, or I should say he refused to follow Brunner's advice. And once they get to the village, this individual has a very, very real moment of remorse, because he realizes that, granted, the orcs are the ones who slaughtered the village, but because he refused to follow Brunner's advice and instructions, they didn't get there in time to fight the orcs off. And so he literally says out loud, this is my fault. And at that point, Brunner does something that he hadn't really done before, at least up to this point in the stories. He, instead of chewing the guy out, he basically goes up to him and he doesn't necessarily tell him it's all right, but he tells him that if we had gotten to this village in time, then at this point, the warlord and his army would have gone to another village and done the exact same thing. But we know at this point, what we're up against, and we know exactly where they are now. So Brunner tries to turn it around to the point of, showing the guy that he's supposed to be, helping. He tries to show him that, we can learn from this. This was a horrible mistake, but we can learn from this. And a big part of that is because, the guy took responsibility, for his failure. And, that's something that not a lot of people of royalty do in this particular setting, unfortunately. So, that must have been something that stood out to Brunner, because, ordinarily, he doesn't bother to meet someone halfway. He just, does what he does. But in this case, though, he didn't have to explain to the guy that there would have been, the deaths of innocents either way. But, just the fact that he saw this, remorse, it's something that, reached out to him and basically, made him, I guess, take a more proactive role, so to speak. Anyway, though, yeah, so you see these, that there are times in which, I guess you could say a better person is sort of brought to the surface, but then, the stories will continue and you realize that there were just, moments, they aren't, transformative events. And there, I also liked how, whenever they interact with, say, elves or dwarves, there are a lot of characteristics that carry over from, literature that we've read in the past, like, say, Lord of the Rings or something like that. Like, there's a lot of characteristics that, are very similar to, the elves and the dwarves and, the Lord of the Rings, books. But at the same time, though, because of the, more cynical setting of Warhammer, the elves tend to be more manipulative, and the dwarves tend to be a lot more greedy, than one is used to. But that doesn't mean, though, that every single elf that they come across is the stereotype, or of what you come to expect in a setting. There are individuals, of multiple races that, have a certain sense of, honor and, decency. Like there's an elven bounty hunter that, goes along with Brunner and several other characters in one of the stories. And, you see how, while this particular elf, he's in the, I guess, cutthroat trade of bounty hunting, he's doing so in order to work his way towards a goal of, justice. And so, you see that, there's a sense of nobility in what this particular character does. And also there's another elven character who comes in the last story, The Blood of the Dragon, and she's like an elven priestess, I believe. But she's someone who she ends up working with Brunner out of necessity, to escape her situation. But the two of them, actually form an unlikely friendship, and basically, because of her nature and I guess of the innate nature of elves, like they're almost empathic. They're able to pick up on emotions. She's one of the few people that is able to, reach Brunner and, try and, I guess, bring out the good person he used to be. And it's partially because of that, Brunner is, I guess, as friendly with her as he is. I mean, granted, he still has a mission, in this case to kill a very huge dragon, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to get there. But at the same time, though, because, he's, got this, person who, has actually gotten closer to him than just about anyone in his life, prior to bounty hunting, that is. Basically, he, you see him be a lot more compassionate with her, and not like they're lovers necessarily, but just, you see that, there is a human being there. It's like, you get glimpses of that beforehand, in certain stories, but at the same time, you also, in this case, though, you see that human being actually breaking through. And even though, that he's going to go back to being the bounty hunter, the fact that this human being, came out, it just, you realize just how, powerful a connection, this elven priestess, made with him. And so I liked the moments like that. And because, Even though C.L. Warner, I mean, he's sticking with, the grim, dark, you know, setting and cynicism of, the Warhammer Fantasy setting. He manages to give us a character who, is very three-dimensional, very multifaceted, and a lot more complex than, you'd think. I mean, initially you're thinking that this is just a clear-cut, badass bounty hunter in a Warhammer Fantasy setting, which he is a badass bounty hunter. But at the same time, though, he's an individual who has, been irrevocably, scarred. But in some ways, there are times where, I mean, while he does have an overall, desire and goal for vengeance, there are times where you see that, he wants to go back to what he used to be, in a sense of, I guess, the hope and innocence, of another time. But you also realize that it can never be. And so that there is a sense of tragedy, with his character, at least when all the, tidbits come together. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed this book. And, it was also really cool, just to, see, monsters like, werewolves, vampires, mummies, and zombies, and also the Skaven come into play, the infamous Ratmen of the Warhammer Fantasy setting. And so in these individual stories, I mean, you get a complex character who's been twisted by I guess the evil of humanity that's been visited upon him. And he's basically fighting fire with fire, and he's going up against I guess the hellish nature of this world that this setting takes place in, and whether it be the evil nature of humanity or the evil of the supernatural. I mean, we're with a character who is very fallible, but relatable in a very strange sort of way. Or at the very least, if we can't outright relate to him, we can relate to, say, the characters that share his adventures to some extent. Like, say, the characters who aren't quite as, cut off from their humanity as Brunner is. And so it's like we see, these events from, the eyes of someone who isn't quite as jaded as he is yet. So such as, the writer who, chronicles his adventures, just for an example. But yeah, I really enjoyed this book. And one of the things another thing that I liked is that, with the novels, I mean, they tend to save the best for last. I mean, because all the stories, deal with, a threat of some sort, but, they tend to save, like, the most dangerous threat, for the very last story. Like, there's one story wherein they have to, Brunner and a, makeshift group of individuals, are attempting to hunt down and kill this dark elf, I guess, chieftain who's formed his own miniature empire of thieves. And you have also, like I said, the very last story, you have the ultimate threat is a dragon that's over 200 feet long and is hundreds if not thousands of years old. And so you see just how terrifying a monster like that would be in this particular setting. And so, I mean, I'm not to say that in those particular stories those are the only threats, but they do tend to be the most dangerous, and they are the ones that are saved for last. And so that was actually pretty cool too. So you never had really an anti-climax boss, as it were. Like, say if you're playing a video game and this boss the game's been building to turns out to be a letdown, or ridiculously easy to defeat. You don't get that in these stories. You get when a book is building to the end, you get you know, a clear struggle, you know, and the danger is very real. I mean, not that it hasn't been real up to the point of, you know, the final battles in the respective books, but it, you know, you get your money's worth, so to speak. So yeah, I really enjoyed Brunner the Bounty Hunter. I'd actually read this once before, but, you know, since I'm, you know, doing reviews now, I went ahead and reread it. I mean, it was a good excuse, and it was just as good as I remembered it. And, you know, in a lot of ways, it made me think of, you know, some of the old, you know, Conan the Barbarian stories, you know, from a long time ago. And so if you like stuff like that, you know, or if you like, you know, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Conan the Barbarian, or even if, you know, you're a fan of, you know, Warhammer Fantasy, but you've never read any of the lore or novels, you know, pertaining to that setting, this book right here, Brunner the Bounty Hunter, I would say, you know, it's not only a good read, but it serves as a good introduction to the Warhammer Fantasy setting in terms of novels. And, you know, I highly recommend it. And I'm going to go ahead and give this book 5 stars out of 5. It was excellent. Thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. If you've got any questions, comments, let me know. Y'all have a good night. Bye.